started recording?
Yeah.
Okay. Go ahead.
So I like this slide, so I cut it from last time. Why does Muslims become beekeepers? And if you remember, I said that beekeeping came between the second and fourth verse, or ayat, between God is the cherisher and sustainer of the worlds, and God is the master of the day of judgment. And also that we have a surah that's named after the bee. But let's move on to tonight's topic, and that is feeding your bees. Why would you feed your bees? Well, we know that there is no creature on earth, but that Allah is its provider. And He knows its place of dwelling and place of storage. All is in a clear register. Lisa and I kind of go by a rule that if Allah gives us the means, we have a responsibility. And so we take care of small animals and bees, feed the bees. And if you're going to take honey from your bees, you have a responsibility to give them back something in return to make sure that they can make it through the winter so that you can get more honey the next year. You don't want to starve your bees off every year. It gets kind of expensive when you start over every year. So how do we repay them? Well, we need to know what are essential nutrients in honeybee health. They need carbohydrates. This is from the nectar, and it provides them with the ability to fly, the energy to fly, to thermoregulate the hive temperature. The hive itself is going to be essentially warm-blooded, meaning that it will raise its temperature to around 90 degrees, depending on the variety of bee, and they hold it at that temperature so that the brood has a relatively constant temperature for development. And without the honey, well, they don't have the food to keep the brood warm. Plus, they need it for winter. The big problem is that plants only bloom for part of the year. If they stop blooming, and if the bees have not collected enough food for the rest of the year, well, they starve out. The other thing they will need is proteins. The bee body is made out of a good bit of protein, and so to have a lot of bees, you need to have a constant flow of protein into the hive. You have lipids. Basically, all metabolism has various lipids for its various functions. And then you have vitamins and minerals. And if you go out in the summer, you may find your bees are on the ground and they're just licking the ground in wet spots. And what they're doing is they're trying to pull up salts and minerals out of the soil. If you do a lot of gardening and you have little pots of plants and all, you may find them crawling around in your pots in the soil, pulling the water out, because you tend to water the pots and they tend to stay wet and provide the solution. Okay. So, where do they get the carbohydrates? Basically, nectar. Nectar is a solution composed of one disaccharide, sucrose, and two hexoses, glucose and fructose. Depending on the tree, or have various amounts of the three main constituents, and that also varies between the plant itself. You know, if you got two trees, they can produce different amounts of the different things. But it's still going to be basically sucrose and the main part, and a little bit of glucose and fructose. Now, bees cannot digest sucrose. The only thing that they can truly digest easily is the glucose and the fructose. And so when you feed your bees sugar water, they cannot actually absorb that. It has to go through the processing bees, and the processing bees add enzymes in it to break down the sucrose and the glucose and fructose. And so, you know, you have to remember that you need to feed them a little early, give them time for them to process the sugar water that you fed them. So never let them get really low on sugar. The other thing you should realize is that the nectar they bring back, they can't actually use that as they're coming back. They can't take a sip of what they collected from the flowers. They have to bring it back, provide it to the processor bees, and the processor bees can then convert it into what I call free honey. It's been processed to a certain extent, and the sucrose has been broken down, but it's still very watery. And that's basically where they get their energy for all the different things they do for keeping the hive warm. Proteins mainly come from the pollen. Pollens are somewhere around 32% protein, depending on the plant again. They have a bunch of sugars and some lipids, some vitamin C, and a few other various things. So, aside from the minerals in the water, the bees mainly collect either nectar or pollen. And they have little bags on their sides for collecting the pollen. Let me see if I can highlight it here. Right there. This bee has collected quite a bit of pollen. They have little bags basically on their back legs, and they shove it all into those bags. If you watch your hive as they're flying in, you can see every once in a while when I'm come in, just got bags on them that are full of pollen. And those are the ones that are collecting what will become new bees. So you need protein for the new bees, and that's mainly from the pollen. They need the nectar for the sugar, and they will mix some of that pre-honey with pollen, pack it into the cells in what's known as bee bread. And that's also for producing, giving them protein after the dearth starts. So the dearth is when the plants stop flowering. You get mainly flowering from February to sometime in July, depending on where you're at. And then here, at least, we have a little extra time at the end when the goldenrod blooms. So, how can you tell if your colony needs help? I tell people that they should leave at least 30 pounds of honey in their hives when they harvest their honey. If they're not going to leave that, then they have to feed heavily so that the bees can then have stores for the summer dearth and the winter. And the University of Georgia recommends that your colony should weigh at least 100 pounds in late fall. Now, if you assume 2 brood boxes and a super, you can expect around 20 pounds of that would be the wood. And then you need the rest of it to be bees and honey. And that's actually going to be nearly 50 pounds of some form of sugar, protein, bee bread, etc. You can't really expect more than about 30 pounds of bees in a hive. So, you want to go out there and lift it up, or you go out there and check it and make sure, when you pull up the super, that it weighs a good bit. Either way, go out there and check and make sure that they have sufficient supplies to make it through the winter, and you can feed them through the winter as well. So, going back to spring, you should know your nectar sources. Look around your property, the area in your neighborhood, and see if you can recognize what is going to feed your bees. also, if you're in the right area, you might get some fruit trees, the pears, plums, apples. Those are usually early blooming. The problem with that is in February you may get a late frost and it will kill those flowers off, and then they're no good anymore because those fruit trees aren't going to bloom again. Orange dandelions. People want to go through and kill all the weeds out of the yard, where they're killing off the bee food as well. April, black locust. I have not seen any black locusts in my area, but it is supposed to be a very good feed. You have clovers, various herbs that flower, typically flower in April. What is it? March winds and May flowers burn in April showers, well, May flowers. Tulip poplar. Very useful tree. You may not like the honey that comes off of tulip poplar. It's very dark. It's not real sweet. But a tulip poplar is one of the largest nectar producers in this area. The average tree will produce 8 pounds of nectar. It will literally drip off the tree if the tree is doing more well. But you notice then, June, July, sourwood. There may be some other few plants that are blooming, but you have just started severely reducing the amount of nectar available to your bees. If you don't have many sourwoods in your area, you're not in the mountains, your dearth may begin at the end of May. And this is when you need to really start checking your hives, making sure you've still got bees coming in and out for collecting, whether they're bringing in pollen, etc. But by the end of July, in this area at least, you're in what's known as the dearth, the first dearth, the summer dearth. And there may be a few bees coming in your hive, but the majority of them are probably going to be sitting outside on the front porch, waiting on somebody to come back and say, hey, I got some food, come get some food. If you remember my last lecture, the reality is that bees tend to have a particular set of plants that they collect from, and if those plants aren't blooming at the time, they sit around. And in June and July, you may see the front of your hive just covered in bees. They're just sitting there. And occasionally, if you keep an eye on it long enough, you will see a bee come in and do a waggle dance on the front of your hive. And it's always interesting, but there is usually going to be a severe reduction. And this is when you really need to make sure that you have enough honey left in your hive for the bees to make it through to September or so. September you get goldenrod. Now goldenrod is a relatively good nectar plant, but you will not like the honey from it. Most people say it smells like old socks. Now, I've never tasted old socks, so I could not tell you. Yes?
Can you explain the dirt a little bit? Can you expand what's
well, the concept of the dearth is there's nothing blooming to provide food for it. Your area basically becomes a desert as far as the bees are concerned. There may be a lot of plants around, but none are providing any food for the bees. We are kind of lucky in this area of Georgia in that while most of the plants stop, there are still a few unusual species that produce a little bit of nectar during the middle of summer. And so you may see a small set of flight lines coming out of your hives, but it will be significantly less than what you will see in the spring. And if they are not bringing back enough food and you had a huge volume of bees develop in the spring, those bees are still eating. And so the ones that are bringing back food, they may not be bringing back enough food to maintain the stores. You may actually, your hives may start getting lighter and lighter in the summer. So, as I say, tulip poplar is one of the largest nectar producer trees that you can find. And the reality is trees tend to produce more nectar than the forbs, the clovers, and the other herbaceous plants. So one tulip poplar can produce nearly 8 pounds of nectar, which works out to about a gallon of nectar per tree. So if you need 50 pounds of honey in your hives, how many trees would they need to be able to collect everything from? I don't mean collect from, I mean they would have to collect every bit of nectar that tree produced. And so if we assume your nectar is approximately 5% sugar and the rest water, that comes out to approximately 0.4 pounds of sugar. We're going to multiply by 1.2 because it's going to be around 18% water. So that's going to add about 20% to that weight. And you divide that into 50 and you'll find you need a little over 100 trees that they would have had to collect everything from. Now, assuming a 2-mile radius of collecting, hopefully you got that. Then, like I say, this is a tulip poplar, which is the greatest producer of honey that we have nectar that we have in this area. So you really have to hope that of the other trees that they have a bunch of other trees that they can get stuff from as well. The point of all this is that, yeah, trees are nice, but you got to make sure if you're living in, on a farm and all the trees have been cut down, put in fields and so on. Okay, your bees are collecting from maybe blackberries and the rows between the fields and so on. So yes, you need to know what your bees are capable of getting food from and how much they can get based in 2-mile radius. Now, there are websites you put in your address and they will draw like a circle of 2-mile radius around where you say your hives are, and you can look for see what percentage of that area is covered in trees and assume the rest of it is probably grass or non-productive as far as the bees are concerned. So you can get an idea of how rich the environment is for your area. Now, if you live in a city, it's a kind of a iffy proposition because city folks like to plant flowers, but they may not plant the type of flowers that your bees need, and they may spray those flowers. I lost several hives a couple of years ago from someone spraying fipronil, which is a very poisonous compound for bees. It only takes nanograms to kill a bee. So let's assume we're going to feed our bees, and I recommend doing so. You can feed them sugar syrup, protein substitutes. In the winter, you can feed them fondants or candy. And of course, you can always plant some extra flowers. Like if you want to buy some clover seed, and as you're driving to work, throw it out the window. So you got clover growing on the side of the road. Yeah, do it. Lisa just bought me, I think, 5 witch hazel trees that were bushes that we're going to plant. 7? Okay, can't count in my mind. Sorry. Witch hazel tree is kind of a strange tree. It blooms in winter. And the days, those blooms will actually survive a frost. And the days that it gets warm enough, the bees will go out and collect from those witch hazel plants. So we're planting 7 witch hazel plants. again?
They're hard to find. If people listening already have their bees and they want to find witch hazel for this next
Cycle.
winter,
Next winter.
they can plant them now. But I found some through Mike's Plants on Etsy.
Mike's plants on
Mike's,
Etsy.
and they're good-looking plants. That's the ones I
Yes,
bought.
they were good-looking plants. The UPS folks did a number to them, but they were good-looking plants.
We're going to be planting those this weekend, and Mike said they should bloom this year.
Yes. They were about, we bought what were supposed to be 1 foot tall plants, and several of them were much larger, and they actually had seed pods on them, so we know at least some of them are already ready to bloom. Okay. Got it?
What's the average size when they mature?
They're, they call them trees, but they're really a really big bush. I think they get maybe 20 feet tall, and they will branch out. You can trim them up to look like a lollipop type tree, but you can also get them where they branch out more like a hazelnut. So, sugar water. Sugar water is good any time of the year if you're not going to be collecting honey. If you're going to collect honey, don't think you'll need sugar water because, you know,
Kind of pretty,
it's
huh?
not really true honey. It's
Excuse me. Hand the brothers this witch hazel blooms.
Okay. Here you go, sir.
Yeah.
As I was saying, if you're going to collect honey, do not feed your bees sugar, because look, just let the other guy see. You're diluting your honey, basically. It's not going to have plant phytochemicals that the plants are going to produce and put in their nectar. Now, some people do it. China's been known for doing stuff like that. The other main thing you may feed your bees is protein substitute. If your hive is light on bees and you don't have any other way to increase their numbers, like moving a frame in from another hive, you can feed them a protein substitute. As I said, the protein is for producing more bees. And while there has been some minor amount of research on what bees need for protein, there isn't a lot. Now, again, the various pollens from various trees have, their own makeup of protein. So hopefully the bees are relatively good with, accepting a variety of proteins. Most of the protein substitutes are going to come out of soybeans. So it's just that. Now, as I said, you can feed pollen patty. It's called a pollen patty, but it doesn't actually have pollen in it. In the spring, if you want to build your numbers up before the nectar flow starts, or if at the end of the nectar flow you have a new hive and it still hasn't really built itself up yet, feed it pollen and sugar so that you've artificially extended the time in which they can improve the volume of their hive. Fondant and candy bars. Fondant, it's like cake icing. Used mainly for the Norfolk here. And candy boards literally is sugar candy. You make your own sugar candy just for your bees. And put them in a little feeder and there you go. They're kind of walk up there and start eating it. And then again, the natural foliage enhancement. So let's go. Common sugar syrup concentrations, 2 to 1. I kind of messed up on that one. 5 to 3, 3 to 2, and 1 to 1. Now, As I said, nectar is typically approximately 5% sugar. So all of these concentrations are much higher than they expect to find in the plants themselves, which is fine because they're going to put it in that hive and dehydrate it till it's only about 18% water, which is going to be, much drier, we use the term drier, than the 2-to-1. So in the winter or late fall, if your hive is light, feed them 2-to-1. In the spring or the summer, if you've got a new hive that you're trying to boost the size of, feed it 1-to-1. And I don't ever feed 3-to-2 or 3-to-2 or 5-to-3. You can if you want. The bees don't care too much. You would use 1-to-1 in the summer because it has extra water in there, and they kind of need the water. They will go out and collect water, especially if your neighbor has a swimming pool. You may get people complaining, hey, your bees are in my swimming pool. Well, not much you can do about that, so give them another source of water. But nonetheless, don't freak out about making these sugar concentrations exact. As I say, they start off with 5% sugar water and they concentrate it down to 18% water to sugar. So anywhere in between there, they're fine with it. Okay? You're also, if you go online and you get into some bee discussion groups, you'll find folks that are very adamant that you should not ever boil the sugar water. The concept being that you burn the sugar and it produces chemicals that can make your bees sick. Now, I'm going to tell you to ignore that, and I'm going to tell you why in just a minute. The reality is you put water on your stove, you heat it up at 212 degrees, it starts boiling, and it will not get any hotter than that until you've got the sugar concentration to the point that there's, the sugar interferes with the boiling. And if you've ever made candy or stuff like that, you've got a candy thermometer, you put it in there, and as the water boils out, it gets hotter and hotter. But it won't actually become fudge, burnt sugar, until it gets almost no water in it. So if you're going to make hard candy or fondant, you're already going to bring it up to a higher temperature than the water's going to boil at when you're trying to just make simple sugar syrup. So I tell folks, ignore that. Just stir. What I do is I bring the water to a boil, and then I put the sugar in it, and then I just start stirring. I may turn the heat off, or I may just leave it on for a little bit, but you just stir and stir and stir. And eventually, the water will turn clear. And at that point, you can stop stirring. Turn the heat off and let it cool down. Once it's cool, you can add amendments. Now, you can add amendments when it's still hot, but since most of the amendments are going to be essential oils, all you're going to do is evaporate more of those out than you really want to. So let it cool and then add your amendments. And as I say, ignore.
So the amendments, are they needed or just giving it flavor?
I'll go over that. But both. A little bit of flavor, a little bit of other stuff. For instance, if you have wintergreen oil in the amendment, the wintergreen oil will help protect your hive a little bit from certain mites. Thymol, which is a common thing, helps with tracheal mites, and a little bit with the varroa mites. But you can add your amendments. Feeders. I moved it over here. All right. This is a common feeder. Costs into the hive, you flip it over, and the sugar water will start coming out here. You slide that into the opening of your hive. Oh, yep, he got one. All sorts of different versions. This one, I'm going to take this off. There's a little hose in the lid. And the bees will crawl up underneath there and kind of look up and start licking the stuff. This one has a metal lid that they just drill a few holes in. Someone has decided, hey, I'm going to make that out of plastic. And the reality is it won't rust on you. But they're a little more expensive, the ones with plastic. These, over there. Yeah, push that back in. These are good for winter. Do not use them in spring or summer. Probably not even in the fall. You don't want to use them when the bees can come out of the hive. The reason being, if you have multiple hives, what you're inviting is the bees from one hive to come to another hive, start taking the sugar water, and at some point, instead of just taking it from the feeder, they're going to go into that hive and start robbing the hive. Take this back. So I recommend only using the in-entrance feeders in winter. And on the days where it's cold, below 53 degrees, because the bees don't want to come out. If they don't come outside, they won't go to another hive and start robbing. Now, you can use these in the summer, but don't put them in the entrance. Go a long way away and sit them on a stone or something. The bees will find them, and that way they'll say, oh, there's food over here, and they're not thinking about going into a different hive to rob it. All right? Ants, yes, you can get ants. A lot of ants. Here is another format feeder. This is what I've been using this summer. You look closely, there's a little hose right there, just in this area. I'm going to hand this to you. Take a sniff. Just take it around and let people smell it. I take those at least 100 feet, preferably 200 to 300 feet away from the hive. You turn it upside down, put a couple of boards underneath it so that they can crawl under there. It doesn't have, that one is already designed where they can crawl in there. This thing, it sits flat. Now, this thing is fine for a distance like that. The other thing you can do is you take an extra brood box, put on the top of your hive, leave the inner cover underneath that box, turn this sucker upside down over the hole in the inner cover. That's why there's only a little spot there for the fluid to come out. Take a good sniff of that.
There's some hole here?
Yes, and the little thing in the middle.
At the hand or
No, I just turn it upside down. Now, it's still got some fluid in it because it won't ever all drain to the bottom.
Because I have so much ants in my backyard.
Yes. Okay, if you have ants, I would recommend...
There are millions.
Yeah, I would recommend getting predator nematodes. It's a nematode that crawls into the body of the ant. It starts eating the ant, laying eggs. The eggs hatch. You get more nematodes, they crawl out, go into another ant. It's a biological control, and it will last for a year or two.
Where do you find it?
Go online, search for predator nematodes, and make sure you get the predator nematode that's for ants. You can spray it in the spring. It will take 2 or 3 weeks to kill a hive, kill a mound, depending on how much you put in the mound. Because, like I say, they crawl into the ants, they lay eggs, And so you got like a biological cycle that eventually will wipe out that mound, but it will take a little while. However, those ants aren't coming back for about a year and a half. Those nematodes can last without food for about a year and a half. So 2 years later, you're probably going to start seeing some more ants, buy some more product from nematodes and spray them. As I say, you can put this one inside your hive, turn it upside down over the inner cover, put this one will take a deep it's a little shallower than a deep, and then you put your outer cover on top of that. This is the standard in-hive feeder. Looks kind of like a frame. You take a couple of frames out. This is especially good for a hive that you are just starting, because you can fill this up. You put it in the thing. You put the frames that you want them to build off of right beside it. And all they have to do is kind of walk over there and get some food. You can then feed them a lot of sugar water and give them the carbohydrates that they need to produce wax, because it takes 8 pounds of honey to produce 1 pound of wax. You need to, when the hive is first starting out, you need to give them a lot of sugar. Okay? Now, you may not be able to see it, but I'm going to pass this around anyway. There's a little blockage thing right here. It's called a ladder, and it allows the bees to crawl down, get to this stuff, crawl back up instead of just falling into the sugar water and drowning. So when you buy one of these, make sure you get the ladders. Make sure you put the ladders in. Okay? Now, the one problem with these is you've got to take your hive apart to put more food in. So it's good, as I say, for a hive that's just starting out, because it's going to be relatively warm weather at that point anyway, and you want to go into your hive pretty often anyway. So every time you go into your hive, refill it. All right? There you go. Not as good in the winter, because you do have to take your hive apart to put food in there. But if your winter temperatures are, above 50,
Thank you.
you won't be chilling your brood that much anyway. So if you're in an area where your temperatures are consistently above 50, you can take your hive apart and use something like this. If your temperatures are below 50 consistently, use the in-entrance feeder. Okay? Because you can replace the in-entrance feeder or refill it without any trouble. Now, another problem with this thing is it takes up the space of 2 frames, but it's not quite that wide. Okay? So when you put it in there, put it up against the wall. If you want to, push the other frames over and leave the gap on the other side of the hive. If you don't do that, what's going to end up happening is they're going to start building wax on the feeder, or they're going to fill that gap in. So this thing's not quite as wide as 2 frames, and so push everything to the side. And then we have the large-scale in-hive feeder. This one this is supposed to float on top of the sugar water so that your bees don't drown. The problem is, if you get enough bees on this, it'll start sinking. But this thing will hold 2 gallons, a gallon on each side. So this is a fill it up and forget about it for a while. Oh, okay. Here you go. Can you see it? There you go. That'll say, now, the bees can crawl up in this area here, crawl over and down. You can see other in-hive feeders like this, and they may have a ladder system in there where they crawl up in the middle, they crawl over, and there's just a small area that they can enter. This one, they get off this full area that they can enter. I kind of like it. Don't use it that much. It's hard to clean. See, it's all wood. Again, if you are in an area where it doesn't get real cold in the winter, since there's only a small area here, you're not tearing your hive totally down to expose the tops of the frames. You can take the cover off and fill this, and you've only exposed a little bit, maybe one frame. And it doesn't take long to refill this sucker and put the lid back on. So it's pretty good about that. All right. Now, again, if you are going to feed your bees in the summer during the dearth, do not feed them on the hive. Now, you can feed them in the hive because then, the other bees don't necessarily smell anything new. Now, if you sniff that, you notice that there was a scent in that sugar water that I created. And that scent can get out of that hive. So you might actually attract bees into the hive if you put enough into a feeder like this. So typically, if you are going to feed with an in-hive feeder in the summer, use an entrance reducer so that they can guard their entrance better. You might want to put it on the wide area if you got a lot of bees coming in and out, but you probably do want to use an entrance reducer. So let's look at the various bees. Where's my cursor? Fondant. As I say, fondant is cake icing, basically. 4 parts sugar, 1 part water, 1/4 teaspoon of vinegar for every pound of sugar. Going to add a little acid to it. You're going to reduce the disease organisms that will grow and start eating your fondant. You are going to mix a lot of air into the fondant at the last stage. So you heat it all up, you put the sugar in there, you put the water in there. There's not much water in that, so it may not easily dissolve initially. So you can add water to it till it does dissolve, but the more water you add, the longer it's going to take to boil it back out. You will heat this until it reaches, this is 109 degrees, 235 degrees Fahrenheit, which is higher than 212, but still not hard crack state. So this is going to end up kind of like taffy, and you're going to mix air into it, and then you pour it in paper plates. And when you go to feed your bees, you just take the paper plate, turn it upside down on the tops of the hive. Never done it. Never used fondant. It's more of a farther north thing. You store it in the freezer, not bad. Yes?
Do you consider making a how-to video later this month?
Yeah, we could.
So keep an eye on the Muslim Beekeeping Initiative YouTube channel.
We may have to make it a couple of times and then film it. Bee candy. Well, the fondant's fine for the cooler areas. Bee candy, if it gets really cold, just put some candy in there. Now, there are folks that actually, wait for Easter to be over and buy the little mints, hard mints with the red coloring in it and all that stuff, and save that for feeding the bees after they take all the honey off. This one, 10 pounds of sugar, 1 quart of water. That's not much water for 10 pounds of sugar. Tablespoon lemon juice, tablespoon of white vinegar, and later a teaspoon of honeybee healthy. Bring it all to water. You bring this up to 250 degrees Fahrenheit. You notice that's a little hotter than the other one, the fondant's 135. This is what candy makers would call a hard crack state. It's going to end up being hard, like regular sugar cane, and you won't mix any air into it. Again, you pour it into a mold, and when you're ready to feed it, you just turn it upside down over the frames. Now, in both of these cases, what you've done is you've created an air gap above your frames, and you might want to use something like a shallow above this, surround your bee candy or fondant with shallow. The other thing is, in places where they use this farther north, they typically also put a blanket into their hive. The blanket is not so much for insulation as it is to absorb moisture, because in really cold areas, when the bees breathe out, they release a bunch of humidity that rises because they're keeping it warm, hits the top of your hive, and it'll condense, and then it starts dripping back down into the hive. It drips on the fondant, it starts dissolving the fondant, and all that stuff starts leaking back down into your hive. The next thing you know, you've got bees that are just crystallized. So you don't want that. As I say, farther north, they will put the blanket. Sometimes it's a bag filled with wood shavings, just something to absorb moisture. All right, so we've got fondant, we've got bee candy, pollen patties. They're called pollen patties, but they do not have any pollen in them. You never feed pollen back to your bees, typically. You don't go out and buy pollen from Amazon to feed your bees. You just, you can spread diseases into your hive that way. So they say don't do it. Now this is an oat mix, oat set of ingredients: soy flour, brewers yeast, fat-free dry milk flour powder. Didn't really believe bees could digest milk. And vitamin C tablets. Mix it all up. Add some 1-to-1 sugar syrup to it. It's right here. And depending on how much volume, I guess, probably use a measurement here. This is dry mix by 6 volume, and add a crushed vitamin C tablet, and they don't tell you how big the vitamin C tablet should be, so to that mixture. Then put it between 2 layers of wax paper. This is going to be a goo, typically. So get you a piece of wax paper, put the stuff on there, get you another piece of wax paper, kind of flatten it out. And then after you've made a bunch of these, you just stack them up together and stick them in a freezer. And then when you go use them, you take one out and defrost it. You can buy a commercial version of this where they've already mixed it all up and they put it between wax paper. Very gooey. I've used that. It's kind of expensive. About $30 for 10 pounds of pollen patties. 10 pounds of pollen patties will last you for a very long time. Typically, you would use maybe 1 in the spring, unless you're really trying to build your numbers up really good, or in which case you might use 2. The problem with these is that when the real pollen starts being available, the bees will abandon these. They just stop eating them because they prefer pollen over soybeans, evidently. Can't blame them. Now you got this gooey thing inside your hive that is great food for other things. And if you put one of these in here in your hive and you've got small hive beetles, you have just created a problem. Because those small hive beetles would lay eggs in that pollen petty, and the next thing you know, it's full of the maggots from the small hive beetles. So if you're going to put these into your hive, make sure you've done a good job of getting rid of small hive beetles. Keep an eye on it. If the bees start abandoning it, you know, if the bees decide they're not going to eat it, take it out, because pollen petties are one of the major creators of small hive beetles. But if you've got a hive that has small set of numbers, feed them a pollen patty. That gets them the protein from creating it, increasing their numbers. You just got to make sure that they will eat it. Now, when you get it out of the freezer, it's got wax paper on both sides, hopefully. Now, take a knife, score that wax paper, just, you know, so you have knife cuts through the wax paper, and the bees can go up there. The bees are going to treat this initially as a foreign body in their hive, and they're going to try to get rid of it. But then they're going to taste it and go, oh, this is food. Okay? So you cut those slices in there, and that's where the bees will initially start eating, and they will work their way out. So run all your cuts in the same direction, and when you put it in your hive, put those cuts perpendicular to the frames, so that at every frame opening, there's several of those cuts that they can then eat from. Again, as I say, you can look and find newer recipes for these, or you can make your own from a mix that you can buy. And we'll go over that right now. Bee Pro. There's actually several protein powders, protein shakes, if you want to call it, for your bees that you can get. Bee Pro is a very common one. Now, I want to point out here that it's $19 for 1 pound. For twice that, you can get 10 pounds. And if you have a lot of bees, you can come up with nearly $2,000 and buy 1,500 pounds. The funny thing about this, if you buy that 1 pound thing and you read the label on the back, they give you instructions for the 1,500 pounds on mixing it up, which is kind of weird, you know. But I recommend buying it in 10 pounds. And if you look closely, it says, free of all contaminants, contains no natural pollen. You know, they're going to tell you, don't feed pollen back to your bees unless you collected it from that hive. Kind of expensive, you know, $40 for 10 pounds, but 10 pounds will last you a very long time. If you assume your pollen patty is going to be about ½ pound that you put into your hive, you know, that's 20 pollen patties dry weight. If you're going to mix sugar water into there, so it's gooey, and that's going to increase it. So you're going to get maybe 25, 30 pollen patties out of a 10 pound container. Right, excuse me. If it's a ½ pound each, 10 pounds, yeah, 25 pollen patties. And that's cheaper than buying the pollen patties already mixed up, because they have all the shipping and the packaging handling and all that stuff. So you can mix this, and as I say on the back, it has instructions on how much sugar water to add to it. Again, don't get real picky with it. The bees aren't going to care. Just make sure it's gooey enough for them to eat it, but not so liquid that it's going to flow. You want it to be gooey. And let's see, last slide. This is short. The essential oils, the supplement for your sugar water, which you smell. It's expensive. This is $31 for 1 pound. Little bitty bottle. But it goes a long way. This is enough for 24 gallons of sugar solution. So, it comes out to a little less than $1 a gallon for your sugar solution that you create. And that's assuming you can use the concentration they recommend. You can reduce that a little bit. And in fact, on the back, I should have taken a picture of the back. Instead of using smoke, some people will mix this up really light in water and just use a spray bottle of this thing. I haven't tried that. I tend not to use smoke unless I'm collecting the honey or something like that, because then I'm going to be in the hive a while. All right, so do not eat the honey from the sugar syrup, especially if you put this stuff in there. It's got a good bit of thymol. Y'all smell that thymol, right? That honey is going to be bitter. You try to feed this to your bees and then collect honey from it. You'll smell it and you'll taste it. Fine plants is not all that great with honey, especially concentrated thyme flavoring. Some people will actually put cake coloring in their sugar water when they feed their bees. And that way they can tell the frames that have been created from the sugar water. Now, a lot of folks will use a blue cake coloring because there aren't any real blue honeys. There is a purple honey. And you may get some purple honey in your hives right now. If your bees cannot find anything else to eat, they may find, kudzu. Kudzu produces a purple honey, which is supposed to taste like grape jelly, but the bees do not like it, so it's kind of rare. The kudzu is really blooming right now. It blooms during the dearth, but unless your bees are really desperate, they're not going to go to it. Still, you get some purple honey in your hive, people find it interesting. So, any questions? Any more questions? So, you got a hive that's weak, and you don't have any way of adding frame in, from some other hive, with some brood in it. Start feeding it pollen tag. Keep an eye on it. This is the time of year when those small hive beetles just multiply. Again, if you've taken a lot of sugar out of your hive, a lot of honey out of your hive, feed during the dearth. Feed the sugar solution during the dearth. And you probably have a huge number of bees at the beginning of the dearth. They're going to live for about a month and a half, and they're going to eat that whole time. So they can go through a bunch of your honey. You feed them sugar water. You're hold their own. Hopefully, when fall comes around and the goldenrod's blooming, they can build back up. At the end of the year, weigh your hive, kind of pick it up, make sure it feels heavy enough that they can make it through the winter. Maybe every 2 weeks during the winter, put a little feeder of sugar water on the front of it, just to make sure they have something. And you may not want to go into your hive during the winter, but you can still pick it up a little bit, maybe a little gap. They really glued it all together, and they tend to really glue your hive together in the fall because they're trying to keep out the drought. That thing may just come up as one piece. You may try to pick up that super, and you just pick up the whole hive. Just be careful you set it back down easily, at least on my stands, because my stands are empty.
You may not have noticed, but we've got goldenrod blooming in full bloom right in front of our bird feeders.
Oh, we got goldenrod blooming already?
Yeah, it started.
There you go. Goldenrod will bloom nearly to first frost.
Till October, November.
Yeah. So at least here, your bees have a good second chance. You know, now leave that honey for them. It's supposed to taste pretty bad. Any other questions? Any other comments?
So I think I was, because we don't have that many folks, so they can just personally interact maybe.
Yeah, we're going to post this on some site somewhere, and if they want to get the information, or if you want to go back and review, you can pause it at some point, write down the formulas or something.
Are you in the group? Okay. So I think you were added after the video was posted, the first video. I'm going to post it again here so you can. It's because right now we wanted to talk about what is required to do for this part of the year. But we can always go back and discuss. If you want to discuss basic stuff, it's best time.
I guess you need to
you can talk to
the lecture. How old is the children?
Oh, you can do it to the
So I'm from a place of life, but I'm looking at you have a little bit of
You have a big project?
No, I keep most of mine. I only had one hive survive last year's drought and the cold spell beginning of this year. And I've been rebuilding
Some of the terminology.
So I only got 40 pounds of honey this year. So I'm
You
keeping
take
mine.
4 apprentices a year, and you come out
I
every
was
2
from your
weeks and
wife
help
last
them
time.
with the bees.
Yes.
It's a very
So by
Thank you.
springtime,
I'll tell
you
the
decide
girls
if you
who
want to
like
do
them.
this.
I can't take any
You
credit
know
for it.
which month to do. Every month you do different things for the bees, and then in the spring, if we have bees, we do splits,
is that Sister
and
Shamin?
you can buy a hive.
Yeah.
Oh, Assalamu alaikum. So she also missed the first class, and we have another brother who missed the first class. If they want to discuss basic stuff, you know, the basic.
Testing. How do you do?
Or speak a little more on that.
What? Assalamu alaikum.